You are not growing, you are moving. And somewhere along the way, you decided those were the same thing. The confusion is not accidental. It was built into the structure of how most people were taught to measure themselves. You watch people who looked busy get praised. You watch stillness get misread as laziness. You absorb the lesson early. Output signals progress. Movement signals seriousness. Doing more means becoming more. That lesson stayed with you, and now it runs in the background of almost everything you do. Most people do not notice this pattern because it feels productive. You wake up, you have tasks, you complete them. You feel the small satisfaction of crossing things off. The day ends with a sense of having moved through something. And that sensation, that feeling of forward motion, gets filed in the mind as growth. But sensation is not the same as trajectory. You can feel like you are advancing while you are standing completely still. The feeling does not lie to you intentionally. It simply cannot tell the difference between motion and direction. That distinction requires something the feeling cannot provide: honest measurement against a fixed point. Most people avoid fixed points. They keep the standard moving. They redefine what growth means based on what they did today. This is not flexibility. This is a mechanism that protects the ego from confronting a gap it does not want to see. Here is something worth sitting with. The person who sends 40 emails a day is not necessarily more productive than the person who sends 4. The person who attends every meeting is not necessarily more engaged than the person who attends one. Volume is a signal. It is just not always the signal people assume it is. Activity creates the texture of progress without requiring the substance of it. This is why it is so persistent. It costs almost nothing to be busy. You can be continuously busy for years and never produce anything that compounds. You can wake up every morning with a full agenda and end every year in roughly the same position you were in 12 months prior. The motion was real. The lists were real. The effort was real. And still, the result was approximately zero movement on anything that actually changed the shape of your life. The reason this continues is not weakness. It is incentive structure. The modern environment is designed to reward engagement, not outcomes. Responding quickly signals competence. Staying available signals dedication. Being seen working signals value. These social rewards are immediate, consistent, and visible. Actual growth, the kind that reshapes who you are or what you are capable of, tends to be slow, invisible, and rarely applauded in real time. So the brain runs a simple calculation. It compares the immediate social reward of appearing productive against the delayed, uncertain return of doing difficult, invisible work. And it consistently chooses the path that pays out faster. Not because you are lazy, because you are rational. The system you are operating inside is not measuring what you think it is measuring. This gets harder to see the more sophisticated you become. When you are young, the activity trap is obvious. You busy yourself with things that clearly do not matter. But as you develop skill, the trap becomes more refined. You begin filling your time with things that are adjacent to the real work. You research instead of deciding. You plan instead of building. You revise instead of shipping. You expand the preparation phase indefinitely because preparation never fails. You cannot be wrong while you are still getting ready. This is not procrastination. Procrastination is avoidance. What is being described here is something more insidious. It is productive avoidance, the appearance of forward motion with the function of stasis. You are not avoiding the work. You are performing a version of it that does not require you to be measured. Identity starts to organize itself around the activity rather than the result. You become someone who works hard, someone who is always in motion, someone who takes things seriously because you are always doing something about them. This identity is real. Other people see it. You feel it. It gets confirmed socially, repeatedly, over time. But identity built on activity is not the same as identity built on result. One requires only continuation. The other requires honesty. The people around you often make this harder to resolve. They mean well. They see your effort and they respond to it. They validate the motion because they cannot see what the motion is not producing. They are working from the same framework you are. Most people in your environment have been conditioned to read activity as virtue. So your busyness gets praised, your tiredness gets respected, your full calendar gets treated as evidence of importance. Social reinforcement calcifies the pattern. After enough years of being validated for the activity, you stop questioning whether the activity is the right activity. Why would you? The feedback loop has been consistent. The environment confirms the behavior. The behavior continues. And the gap between where you are and where genuine growth would have taken you quietly widens, without alarm, without obvious warning. There is a specific internal experience that often accompanies this pattern, a subtle but persistent exhaustion that is not explained by how hard you worked, a sense that despite the motion, something essential has not shifted. You might notice it on Sunday evenings or at the end of a year, a quiet recognition that the version of yourself looking back at the past 12 months is not meaningfully different from the version that started them. That recognition is important. Most people move through it quickly. They make a plan. They add more activity. They resolve to do it better next year. And the cycle restarts. The reason they move through it quickly is that sitting with it is uncomfortable in a specific way. It raises a question about the activity itself. Not whether you did enough of it, but whether the activity was ever pointed at anything real. Whether the motion was ever in service of a fixed, honest target. And that question has implications that are easier to avoid than to answer. What is worth recognizing here is not a character flaw. It is a design response. You were placed in an environment that consistently rewarded visible effort. You adapted to that environment with precision. You became very good at producing visible effort. That adaptation was rational given the inputs you received. The problem is that the environment was measuring the wrong thing, and you learned to optimize for the measurement rather than the underlying reality it was supposed to represent. This is not a rare failure. It is how most institutional and social environments operate. They create proxies for value. They reward performance of the proxy. The actual thing the proxy was meant to represent drifts further from the measurement without the system correcting for it. You internalize the proxy, and then you forgot it was a proxy, and once you forget the proxy is a proxy, you start protecting it. You defend activity, because without it, you would have to measure yourself differently. Now consider what happens to someone operating from this pattern over a longer time horizon. Early in life, the gap between activity and growth is small and somewhat forgivable. There is still time for compounding to work. The stakes of any single year are not yet decisive, but as time passes, the gap does not stay small. It accumulates. 10 years of confusing motion with direction produces a specific kind of life, one that looks credentialed, appears active, feels full, and yet cannot point to a clear line of genuine development that tracks back through those years. The person cannot always name what is wrong. They have done so much. They have not been idle. They do not recognize themselves as someone who wasted time because they did not waste time in any obvious way. They spent it. They just spent it on activities that circled the real work without ever landing on it. That is the structure of the pattern, not failure, not laziness, not bad character, circular motion that was always described as forward movement. Here is where the reframe sits, and it is uncomfortable not because it is harsh, but because it is structurally quiet. What felt like discipline was often compliance. You were not doing the hard thing. You were doing the acceptable thing. The hard thing would have required you to stop, measure honestly, and sit with uncertainty long enough to choose a direction with no guarantee of reward. The acceptable thing kept you inside the feedback loop, active, visible, validated. What felt like growth was often maintenance dressed in the language of progress. The distinction matters not as a moral judgment, but as a practical one. If you cannot tell the difference between the two, you cannot make a different choice. You will continue selecting activities based on how they feel rather than what they compound into. And the most sophisticated version of this trap is one where the activities feel genuinely meaningful, where the busyness carries real conviction, where you believe fully and sincerely that you are building something. And yet the architecture of what you are building has never been examined against any fixed, honest point. Real growth has a specific quality that distinguishes it from activity. It is irreversible. When you have actually grown in some dimension, you cannot return to not knowing what you now know. You cannot undevelop the capacity. You cannot go back to being the person who found that thing difficult. The growth has changed the structure of what you are capable of. It does not require maintenance or motivation to remain. It is simply different territory now. Activity does not do this. Activity can stop and you return to baseline. Activity fills time without altering structure. You can be very good at an activity for a long time and discover one day that the underlying capacity has not changed. You have practiced performing the task without ever deepening the skill that the task was supposed to build. You were not failing, you were repeating, and you called it growth.